Hello everyone, welcome back to Module 2. This is actually Lesson 2 of Zero to Permit. In this lesson, we want to talk about the forms or the different types of forms that must be submitted when you prepare and submit your permit application to the Air Quality Management District. There are three core components of a complete permit application, and the forms is one of the three components. In the next two lessons, we'll talk about the fees as well as the engineering evaluation. And those are the second and third components of a complete permit application, respectively. Now, in general, there are 5 forms or 5 types of forms that need to be submitted with each permit application. The Form 400A, which you see here, a Form 400 CEQA, one or more forms from the Form 500 series of forms. And the Form 500 series of forms is a group of forms. And so if you're a Title V facility, you will need to submit one or more forms from the Form 500 series, as well as one form from the Form 400E series. And the Form 400E is, again, a series of forms that must be submitted with your permit application. Now, the one form that we don't have a picture of here, and I apologize for this in advance, is the Form 400 XPP. And we'll talk about what that form means or what that form signifies or what that form does later on within this lesson. So let's start with the Form 400A. The Form 400A has basic information about the facility and the equipment being permitted. Information like the name, the address, the equipment address, the mailing address, the type of permit application, the name of the contact, email address, phone number, fax number, and so forth. In addition, you have to note the type of permit application that is being submitted. There are different types of permit applications that you can submit to the Air District. There's typical construction, permit to construct applications, there are permit modifications, there's administrative changes, there's permit to operate, there's Title V facility amendments, there's ERC notifications and registrations. There are a bunch of different types of permit applications that need to be submitted, or you can submit, and you will have to note this on your Form 400A. In addition, you have to note the type of facility that is submitting this permit application. And so it could be a reclaim and or Title V facility. Again, this form is asking for very basic information. It's sort of an administrative type of form that simply tells the AQMD who is submitting this permit application. Now, when it comes to the Form 400A, a separate Form 400A is going to be required for each piece of equipment being permitted. So as an example, if you're permitting 50 engines, then each engine will need to have its own Form 400A. And so you would need to have 50 Form 400As in total for this one example. In addition to that, an additional Form 400A is required for a facility with a facility permit. Because if you have a facility permit and you submit a permit modification or a permit for a piece of equipment that will be added to your facility and thus your facility permit, you also need to modify your facility permit. And so as an example, with the 50 engines that we used before, if those 50 engines are at a reclaim or Title V facility, then in addition to the 50 Form 400As for each of the engines, you will need to submit an additional Form 400A to modify the facility permit as well. Now, generally speaking, the two types of facilities that have facility permits are ones that are in the Title V program and or the reclaim program. And so if your facility is in one of those, either of those programs or both of those programs, then you will have a facility permit. And this additional Form 400A is required every time you submit a permit application. The second form here that we see on the screen is a Form 400 CEQA. And CEQA, CEQA, simply stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. Now, the CEQA form or the Form 400 CEQA is simply a screening tool used by the AQMD to determine if the project or the piece of equipment being permitted is subject to CEQA. Now, CEQA is a state law designed to inform the government as well as the public about any potential adverse effects to the environment due to the project. And so if you actually look at the Form 400 CEQA, and there's actually a link down below which you can actually download the Form 400 CEQA, you'll simply see that majority of the form are simply a series of yes or no questions about your project. And now depending on how you answer these questions will determine whether or not additional information is needed to demonstrate compliance with CEQA. And so if you answer all no's on the CEQA form, that means that at a screening level, your project is determined to be exempt from CEQA. However, if you answer a yes to one or more of the questions that are on the Form 400 CEQA, then additional information may be needed to further assess the applicability to CEQA. Now, when it comes to how many CEQA forms are needed, one form is needed per project. And so, like we said earlier, if we have a group of 50 engines and you're submitting, all 50 of those engines are part of one project, then you will only need one CEQA form for all of those 50 engines. Now, like I said earlier, depending on how you answer the questions on this form, additional information may be needed to satisfy your requirements under CEQA. Now, the next form is actually a series of forms, and we call this the Form 500 series of forms. And these forms are needed for facilities that are in the Title V program. And so if you're in the Title V program, then you are a major source of air pollution. Your facility tends to be larger. Your emission levels tend to be over 10 tons of VOC or NOx per year. And thus you're subject to Title V of the Clean Air Act and all the additional monitoring, reporting, and record keeping requirements applicable to those facilities. And so if you're a Title V facility, then you will need to submit forms from the 500 series or the 500 group of forms. Now, the exact type of Title V forms that need to be submitted depend on the type of permit being prepared and submitted. So there are more than one type of Form 500 form. There's actually a group of them. And the type of form that you actually submit will depend on the permit application that you are preparing. And so the AQMD has actually prepared a Title V form matrix to help you determine the type of form or the type of Title V form that need to be submitted with your permit application. And so you can see that for different types of permit applications listed here to the left, you can see that a variety of forms are needed as you scroll to the right. Now, when preparing a permit application for a Title V facility, you want to refer to this matrix because not every Title V form will need to be submitted when you permit at a Title V facility. Only certain ones will be needed. So again, only certain forms from the Form 500 series of forms will be needed, and the forms that are needed are noted here on this Title V application matrix. Now, the fourth type of form is a Form 400 XPP, and XPP stands for Expedited Permit Processing. Now, generally, you will need to submit a Form 400 XPP if you wish to have the processing of your permit expedited. Now, this is an ongoing question that we get all the time. We've talked about this extensively within our content library, and that is, how long does it take to get a permit from the Air Quality Management District? And the answer is that it depends, and it depends on how complete your permit application is at the time that you submit it. And so you want to be sure that you submit a complete permit application every time you submit a permit application, and that is the best way to ensure that you can get your permit quickly. However, if you want your permit faster, as a rule of thumb, we typically see that between 3 and 6 months is the amount of time needed to get a permit from the Air District. Now, if you want to shorten that time, then you can request to have expedited permit processing, but you will need to pay. And so by submitting the Form 400 XPP, you actually authorize the permit engineer to work on his or her overtime, or let me take that back. When you submit the Form 400 XPP, you really authorize the permit engineer to work overtime on his or her overtime on your permit application in order to expedite the processing of your permit application, and thus the issuance of your permit at the end will be faster. Now, generally, expedited permit processing is subject to availability, and you won't really know if your permit can qualify for expedited permit processing until you submit the form and pay the fee. Sometimes you can talk to your engineer ahead of time to see if he or she has the capacity to work on your permit on overtime, but generally expedited permit processing is subject to availability. Now, if the engineer cannot work on your permit on overtime because of a previous engagement or just no capacity at all, then the fee will be returned to you within 30 days and you'll know. So like I said, if the engineer cannot work on your permit overtime, then you'll be notified and then your money will be refunded within 30 days. Now, the last and final form in this group, or the basic permit processing forms, is actually, again, a group of forms. And this is called the 400E series. And the E series are a group of equipment-specific forms. And the design or the intent of these Form 400E forms is to provide the AQMD more information about the equipment being permitted. And so again, these forms are equipment specific. And so if you actually go to the page on the AQMD's website that lists all the Form 400Es, you'll see it has a number, the AQMD has a number of different Form 400E forms. You have a E3, a 400E3 for a scrubber, a 400E7 for dry equipment cleaning or dry cleaning equipment, a 400E9A for external combustion heater or boiler, and so forth. And so you can see that these forms are very specific to the piece of equipment that you are submitting. Now, on the top here, you see that there's a Form 400EGI. Now, if no form is available here for your piece of equipment, then you're supposed to use the Form 400EGI when you prepare your permit application. And so again, you simply go to the AQMD's website, select the form that pertains to your equipment and fill it out, and then you would submit that with your permit application when you submit that to the Air District. And like I said, if no form is available for the piece of equipment that you're permitting, then simply use the Form 400EGI. Now again, the Form 400E is just designed to provide more information to the AQMD about the equipment and or process that you're trying to permit. The types of information, the types of questions that are on the Form 400E are very specific. You know, what kind of engine is it? What's the size? What's the fuel? What are the emissions? What's the control efficiency? What kind of control devices are installed, and so forth. And so again, the Form 400E is just designed to provide more information to the AQMD about the equipment that you're trying to permit. And remember, only one Form 400E is needed for each equipment being permitted. And so if we go back to the example that we talked about earlier about the 50 engines, then you will need one Form 400E for each of those engines, in addition to one Form 400A for each of those engines. So again, one Form 400E is needed for each piece of equipment being permitted. And so as a summary, so we've reached the end here of this lesson, so let's talk about a little summary here. There are 5 general forms that need to be submitted with your permit application. There's a Form 400A, a Form 400 CEQA, a Form 400 XBP, one or more forms from the 500 series of forms, and then a equipment-specific Form 400E. And then, like I said, if there is no specific E-series form for your equipment, then you need to use Form 400EGI. Now, when it comes to these forms, you want to be sure that the forms are complete. All the information that's asked for is filled in. And then most importantly, you want to be sure that the form is signed by the proper person. Now, what I mean by that is for Title V facilities, only the responsible official that's on record at the Air District can sign these forms, no one else. And so you want to be sure that the responsible official at your facility signs these forms if you are part of the Title V program. And then if you're not part of the Title V program, then you just want to be sure that someone who has the authority to sign can sign. But be sure that the forms are complete and signed prior to submission. So with that, that's the first core element of a permit application. which is the forms. And like as we talked about earlier, we'll talk about the permitting fees and the engineering evaluation in future lessons, but we covered the first one here. So there you have it. We'll see you in lesson 3. Take care.